Thank you. Thank you, everyone. And welcome. It's wonderful to see so many people that are interested in learning something about the brain. Some of the people I recognize have been in these classes before. I promise not to give you a test and make you show how much you do or do not remember. Now, that's especially since what we're going to focus on in this series of lectures is going to be learning and memory. And the reason learning and memory are considered a unit is because if you didn't learn something, then you can't remember it, right? So scientists always say learning and memory, not one or the other. So this is wonderful. This is Norma Clifford's little grandchildren. And this is Pierce and Liam. And I wanted to show you this picture because I want you to be amazed by the end of the 6 weeks of what the brain is capable of doing and how it's organized. These little guys have more neurons in their brains right now than they will ever have again. So right after you're born, you have about twice as many neurons as you're going to have as an adult. And that's all the neurons you're ever going to have. So the reason we have to be careful how we treat our brains and keep our brains healthy is because as you age, you start losing neurons. And with very rare exceptions, they're not replaced. So that means you lose them, they're gone forever. And you lose the function associated with them. And so we'll be talking a lot about these things. So I'm going to go ahead and start this. I want to make sure everyone knows the PowerPoint presentation will be up on the Osher site. I put words on the slides in addition to pictures, just so that when you go on the site, things will make more sense to you than just seeing the picture in isolation and not having any words there. But I'm not going to stand up here and just read things, okay? That's how it's going to be. I also want to introduce Fred. Fred is really the star of this. Now, it's hard for some of you to see him, but I took pictures of him, and so he's going to be up here. But this is the star of this show, okay? So let me start. I have to point this in the right direction, obviously, by just talking a little bit about what we're going to do over the next 6 weeks. Because today is going to be a day where we're going to build our basic vocabulary and learn some terms that are used in neuroscience so that we can communicate with each other, okay? You have to be able to do that. So today what we're going to do is a general vocabulary and the concepts of just how the brain works in general, and I hope to wow you. If in the middle of something I say, if it's not clear, stop me, ask a question, feel free to do that. But if you have general questions about other disorders or other things you're interested in, I'll try to make sure that periodically we just have a question and answer time and you can answer that. But I want to be able to keep the thought going about where we're going and where I'm going. And so otherwise, just hold on and I'll probably answer your questions. Then the next time we're going to talk about the cellular and molecular organization of the brain, because ultimately being able to learn something and remember it means that you've made a change within the cells of your brain. And this is very fundamental to understand. So we have to understand something about how the brain is organized at that level. And I'm used to talking to the lay public. Again, if I'm not clear, you just stop and ask me and I'll clarify something. The next two lectures, we're going to talk about different areas of the brain that are involved in different kinds of memory. There's lots of different kinds of memory. There's memory of facts. There's memory of how to do a golf swing. There's memory of knowing how to walk. There's a memory of how to use words. There's all kinds of different memories, and different areas of the brain control these different types of memory. And so we need to learn those different things. And also, this is going to be of a more interesting lecture in that I'm going to talk about what we've learned in modern neuroscience about what memory is not, okay? And when memory fails us. So when we're absolutely certain we remember something and somebody in our family says, no, that's not how it happened at all. And you're like, huh? Well, the other person's memory might be right either. And if you'd actually taken a snapshot of the event, you both might be wrong. So this gives us insight into what memory really is about in the brain. What is it about? When does it fail us naturally? So this gives us insight into how it must be working in general, because this is a fundamental property of the brain. So then we're going to talk about disorders that affect memory, and I'm going to focus, as I normally do, on Alzheimer's disease, since this is the #1 disorder in the United States that robs people of various kinds of memory. And by the time we get to this lecture, you will already be able to anticipate exactly what areas of the brain are involved in the disease, because you will already know what areas of the brain are involved in different kinds of memory. So when I say a person with that disease loses this kind of memory, you'll know exactly where in that brain this disease has affected. And so this is, we'll get to that and we'll talk about Alzheimer's. I'm sure you're very interested in that. And then here, I want to end on an up note. You never want to end on Alzheimer's. It's just not a good place to end. So we're going to end on a little up note, and that is how to keep your brain healthy. What do you need to do the best you can do? Okay? What is under your control and what is not? So we can only control the things that are under our control, and so we'll focus on that and what neuroscience has taught us about this. So are we ready for this? Ready? All right, everyone can hear me? Okay, and I realize not everyone can see Fred well. Maybe we'll have a higher table next time and we'll put him up on a pedestal. He likes that. Okay? So let's just start with some basic definitions. And again, well, this is going to be on the website. I want you to really watch me, because I'm going to walk you through the concepts. And so I'm not interested in you reading off of the PowerPoint. I want you to watch me and see if you can learn the basic concepts by hearing what I have to say. Okay? So the very most general way that we separate the nervous system, which controls every aspect of our lives, is to separate it into the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. So the central nervous system consists of the brain and the spinal cord. And the brain and the spinal cord are encased in bone, so it's in an enclosed compartment. This is very important to understand. It's so important to our lives that it's protected by bone. So you have your cranium, you have your skull protecting the brain, and you have your vertebrae protecting your spinal cord. So that's the central nervous system. This is the central nervous system right here in our little man. And the peripheral nervous system is basically any nervous element that lies outside of the brain and spinal cord. So if you cut your finger, and it hurts, you've hit particular nerves. This is why, okay? So those are in the peripheral nervous system. Now, obviously, the central and peripheral nervous systems are associated with each other, and we will learn a little bit about how that takes place. What I want you to just see is there's a real separation here. Your brain and spinal cord that are encased in bone because they're so very important. They control everything that's going on. Every thought you have, everything you see, every movement you make is being controlled by the central nervous system. And the peripheral nervous system is just sort of out there in the body doing what the brain wants, doing what the central nervous system wants, or feeling what happens out there in the periphery, okay? Now, whether it's the central or the peripheral nervous system, the central nervous system, peripheral nervous system are made up of one specific cell type called a neuron. So this is what we mean by a nerve cell. In the brain alone, now remember, the brain is only part of the central nervous system. It's just this part right here, what's in your head. There's 100 billion neurons. 100 billion. Now what's interesting there is Norma's little grandchildren, Pierce and Liam, were born with 200 billion. Okay? 200 billion nerve cells competing with each other for space, for connections, for everything, to control. And you notice how long, like it takes a child a year before it can walk. And that's because it takes a year for the nervous system to develop to the point that the child can control its movements. It's the brain that's controlling those movements, and it takes a year for those areas of the brain to develop before we can stand upright and make a movement and walk. So all the milestones, for all of you who have children and grandchildren, all of the milestones physicians use to look at child development really are all milestones of brain development. Okay? When you walk, when you talk, when you can tell that when a person's out of the room that they still exist, every single thing you can do, every thought you have, every movement you make, everything you see, you hear, and you feel is controlled by your brain. And so those baby brains are going crazy trying to make sense out of the world now. And huge numbers of neurons will be lost in this process. So in an adult, we're left with 100 billion nerve cells, okay? So that's what this course is going to be about, is learning about all these different nerve cells, okay? So there's Fred up there again, okay? Now what we need to do is just in general, and I try to stay away from using jargon, and I try hard to do that, but this is a science course, and so there's always going to be a lot of jargon. We have ways of referring to the brain a certain way, so I'm going to use my own body, okay? Rostral means towards the head, caudal means towards the tail. But these are relational terms. So this is rostral, this is caudal, but this is rostral to this. So it's relational, okay? This is dorsal, which means towards up, and this is ventral, which means the underbelly. So this is dorsal, this is ventral, but in my spinal cord, this is dorsal and this is ventral. This is towards the back, this is towards the belly. And again, these are relational terms. So we also have medial and lateral. These are more obvious to you. Medial means towards the midline of the body. We have a midline here. And lateral means towards the side. So for example, if we look at Fred, this is rostral, this is caudal. So this is the front of the brain, this is the back of the brain. This is dorsal towards the top, and this is ventral towards the bottom. And again, medial and lateral. Our actual brains have two hemispheres. Fred only has one hemisphere, okay, and that's for teaching purposes, okay? So again, I'm going to try to stay away from using just slinging these terms out, but I do want you to know that when you read something and you say, if I were to say to you, areas of the brain that control the highest function, executive function, are we going to steal that thing or not steal that thing? Our brains compute. We have a moral system that has been developed in our brain and is a result of our brain anatomy. Whether we decide to do it or not, we weigh the consequences of our actions. The highest areas of the brain control that, and these are all located rostrally, right behind the forehead. Okay? That one little example is going to be a good one. If you hit the front of your head and you damage this area that has this moral compass, you can no longer apply morals to your behavior. And this happens to patients who lose this area of their brain. They no longer can weigh the consequence of their actions and let moral values guide their decision making. Now look what happens as we develop. Liam and Pierce are developing. This area of the brain is going crazy. And what it's doing is it's abstracting the mores of the culture from what it observes. So by the time you're 1, 2, 3 years old, you already know how you can expect to be treated by adults in your world, and you're already starting to put together what's appropriate for how you treat others. Why childhood and treating children a particular way is so important. So those values that you abstract early on stay with you. And part of what you do is you weigh the consequences of your behavior. Can I get away with stealing that piece of candy or not? Mommy says no, but is mommy looking? Okay? Weighing the consequences of our behavior is a big thing that we do all of our lives. And again, basic principle we're going to again and again talk about in this class is that patients who have damage to particular areas lose the function that that area controls. And whether that's being able to see or apply morals to your behavior, it doesn't matter. There's not a thing you can do, there's not an ability you have, nothing that can't be taken away with the right brain damage. Okay? File that one away. And this is why we need to take care of our brains. So, these are just our little ways of talking about the brain. Now, the brain is called the encephalon. That's an old terminology from long, long ago. And we typically separate the brain into 5 subdivisions. And again, I'll go through it on here, and then I'm going to use Fred to do this as well. So we have 5 subdivisions to the brain, and they differ in their evolutionary history, and they also differ in their developmental history. And so this is why we do this. But we also do this so that physicians can talk to one another about where in the brain does this patient have a problem. So when I use the term lesion, it means some kind of damage. And it could be from a hit to the head, it could be a brain tumor, it could be a disease like Alzheimer's. So lesion is a general term, like a lesion on your body. If you get a bug bite or a scratch or something, it just means in general. So physicians want to be able to talk to each other. So they separate the brain, which is what our focus is. This is going to be higher order things. Focus and call it by these 5 different terminologies. So the highest levels of the brain are called the telencephalon. We're going to come back to what's there. Telencephalon is going to be like the outer part of what you see in this hemisphere. Then the diencephalon, which is going to be right there. Then the mesencephalon, which means midbrain, and you see that this little area lies kind of midway between that and that. So it's called the midbrain. The metencephalon and the myelencephalon, which is connected to the spinal cord. And again, a test. What makes up the central nervous system? The brain and the spinal cord. The only things encased in bone. The things that make us who we are. Okay? Encased in bone and protected. So these are the 5 subdivisions. So for example, if there was a physician in the room who was a neurologist, and I said to them, I have a family member who has a tumor in the mesencephalon, that physician would know exactly that the tumor was located in this area of the brain. And that would be important because what we're going to learn is that different areas of the brain have different functions. Okay? Just like this front part controls moral behavior and weighing consequences of actions, other areas of the brain control completely different functions. And so we have to learn a little bit about that. Okay? So this is Fred, and you see that Fred has a lot of colors. Well, that isn't just so he's beautiful. Okay? It's because every different color represents a different function that the brain's carrying out. And when you look at this and what we call these, every little place is called an area. Like this is area 4, and I'll tell you later where that numbering system came from. But area 4 has a different function from this yellow area down here. And area 17 here has a completely different function from this area down here. Okay? So the reason the model has all these colors is because there's different functions. So some areas of the brain allow us to make a voluntary movement. Other areas of the brain make our arms move and swing as we walk. Other areas of the brain change our center of gravity as we move through space. Other areas of the brain control the amount of tension that's in your anti-gravity muscles that allow you to stand up, and without which you wouldn't be able to make a movement. If you didn't have background tone in your legs, you wouldn't be able to walk. Right? Okay? So different areas of the brain control different things. And yet, one of the things I want you to most see in this class and stand in awe of is that it's all connected in a way that makes it all seem like it's happening to you and it's all happening right now. If I make a decision, I'm going to reach out and touch the brain model, I just reach out and touch the brain model. That involves hundreds of areas of the brain. I can even do it without looking, okay? So the point is that this all takes place in this incredible structure with its 100 billion nerve cells that are complexly interconnected with each other, and one area of the brain up here knoweth what the other areas do. Okay? So when I want to make a voluntary movement, I'm going to move towards the projector. My brain is planning the movement, and it makes my leg muscles move, not my arm. Okay? It makes my leg muscles move. But notice something. I can move in space, maintain my gravity, look around the room, process information, move my hand, and talk all at the same time. Well, this is all coordinated by this wonderful structure in there. So this is why we want to take care of this, right? Okay, so let's look at just a couple of areas and look at the kinds of things that go on in these areas, because this is what you're interested in. And of course, it's too dark in here for me to see my watch, so somebody will keep the time. Okay, so telencephalon. Okay, to remind you again, the telencephalon is this rostral area of the brain. It's the highest order area of our brain. Okay? So the telencephalon consists of two hemispheres. This is Fred again, only has one. So we have two hemispheres in our head. We basically have two brains in our head. Okay? But they're coordinated with each other, so you don't ever notice that. At any rate, the very outer portion is called the cortex. Now, everyone's heard of the cortex. You know, when someone's not very smart, you say, well, they don't have much gray matter. What that means, they don't have much cortex, okay? It's the wrinkly part that's on the outside, and it's going to be the focus of what we're going to do for 6 lectures together, because this is the highest order information that's being processed is being processed by the cortex. Learning and memory are higher order processes in general, the kind of thing you normally think of as being memory. Okay? So the telencephalon is responsible for voluntary action and thought. Okay? I decide to move towards the projector. That's a voluntary action. Now note, that's different than if there's a bright light that appears out here and I turn and I look at it. That's reflex. I turn and look at it. But that's a reflex. If I decide to turn and look at my finger, that is a voluntary action. All voluntary action, regardless of the kind it is controlled by the telencephalon, by the cortex, basically. All voluntary thought. Okay? So voluntary thought is when I decide to have a thought about something, as opposed to a habit. Okay? Habits can take place, they just take place, and we're not in charge of that. Okay? So the telencephalon controls that. Now down here, the diencephalon. So the diencephalon, we're going to move caudally. The diencephalon is located right here. Okay, so telencephalon up here, diencephalon here. So the diencephalon is closely related to the telencephalon. So I'm going to give 2 examples. There's 2 main areas in this diencephalon region. They have hundreds of nuclei, hundreds of individual groups of neurons that control individual functions. But nonetheless, you can divide it in 2 big sections. One is called the hypothalamus, which means the lower, hypo, beneath, okay? It controls basically all of the functions in your body that are related to homeostasis. So homeostasis means things like your blood pressure, means like your temperature. Human beings are mammals that maintain their temperature within a very narrow range, okay? And no matter what the ambient temperature is, your temperature remains in that range. Well, that I told you. There's not a thing you can do, not a single function. You have nothing that can't be taken away with the right brain lesion, right? Every single thing is controlled by the brain. That means people can have lesions or damage to their brain that take away their ability to regulate the temperature. And they die. Okay? You have to be able to regulate your temperature. Why? Why do you need to regulate your temperature? You need to regulate your temperature because if your brain gets too hot, it kills neurons. And so you have to maintain a body temperature within a very narrow range to keep your brain healthy, okay? The hypothalamus controls eating. It's your brain that tells you when you're full. It's your brain that tells you when you're hungry. And so if you have a dysregulation of that, then you don't get the appropriate signals. So there are people who have damage to areas of this area of the brain that continue to eat after they're full because they're not getting the signal that tells their brain that you're full. So they keep eating. So every single thing you can do is being controlled by the brain. The other part of the diencephalon is called the thalamus, so that's that upper part. And the thalamus is closely connected to this cortex. So the upper part of this is closely associated with this outer part, which is going to be the main part of what we're going to talk about. So what is this about? Well, let me give you one example. Let's imagine that I stub my toe. Okay? I stub my toe and it hurts. And I turn and I look. Well, lo and behold, see, you think that I turn and look and it's my toe that I stub, so that makes sense. Your brain tells you that that's the right place to look. Now, what would happen if you stubbed your toe but you looked at your arm? Okay? Well, that wouldn't make any sense. But the point is that subjective experience, meaning our feeling of something happening to us, is a product of the cortex. And that means it can go awry. And we're going to talk about some significant times when it does. So, the distance between your toe and your cortex to tell you subjectively you stubbed your toe, and the distance between your eye and your cortex is very different, isn't it? Yet if you stub your toe, you look immediately and you have like an immediate sensation that everything is right, it's just like what it ought to be. But one distance is like this, and the other distance is this. Well, the reason it all seems simultaneous is because your thalamus is keeping all the information from being transmitted to where subjective experience occurs till everybody's there and ready to be transmitted. So it doesn't send one thing first and then the next thing. It holds it in like a buffer and then sends it on at the appropriate time. So when I touch my hand and I look at where I'm touched, it seems simultaneous to my visual system and my somatosensory system or my body system. But it's not because it just is that way. It's because my brain tells me so. So I'll talk to you about some cases where patients lose this ability. And they have a lot of confusion in the world because things are taking place at the wrong time. And when they look at a certain part of their body, something else is happening than what their brain tells them. Okay? We'll come to a lot of examples. Yes?
Does one of these control the ability to speak?
Oh, absolutely. We're going to use that as an example. Yes. Okay, every single function is controlled by the brain, so the gentleman wanted to know if areas were involved in controlling speech and language and understanding speech and language. And we're going to come back. That's a very higher order function, so that means it's telencephalic function. It's cortex, okay? Anything that's higher order function is higher up. Okay, so these are the higher order areas of the brain. And then we have the mesencephalon, we have the metencephalon, and we have the myelencephalon. So I'm going to do these rather quick. The mesencephalon basically has to do with a lot of basic reflexes. So when there's a bright light to the side, you turn and you look at it. Okay? That's a reflex. So that's not controlled by higher order areas. It's kind of a lower down function. And your metencephalon, it consists of two areas. It consists of what we call the pons, and then this little fist-shaped structure here that we're going to come back to later called the cerebellum. The word cerebellum means little cerebrum, and it's involved in learned, skilled motor movement. Okay? And the pons, which is also part of this, is the bridge between learned, skilled motor movement and the rest of the brain. So it is still a lower down function. important one. And then the myelencephalon is what we call the medulla, and it's the area of the brain that's connected to the spinal cord. Okay? So this is the lowest level of function of the brain, but the most important in many ways. The medulla controls heart rate, breathing, things without which we cannot do. Okay? And so we take these things for granted. But in fact, every breath you take is being controlled by your brain. Okay? So, it goes without saying. Let's back up and think about this. You have damage up here in your telencephalon. You might lose something that really matters. You might lose your ability to understand language, for example. You might lose your ability to make a voluntary movement. You might be paralyzed. There might be some pretty terrible things, don't get me wrong. But you could live through it. You can live with it. You damage the medulla and damage an area that controls your heart rate, you die. Okay? Now, just to give you an idea of like some of the things we're going to be talking about, your brain and your spinal cord are a closed compartment. Isn't that right? Is that right? Do we all agree? Encased in bone, hi Nancy, encased in bone and vertebrae, right? So now let's imagine, if that's true, if it's encased in bone, does everyone understand how it must be under a constant pressure? It's enclosed. It's in an enclosed system. Does that make sense? Okay. So now let's imagine a great big brain tumor about this size up here. Where does the brain go? It moves down. So if you have a brain tumor up here, you wouldn't die from the brain tumor itself. The brain tumor itself might interfere with functions up here, but that's not what kills you. What kills you is that it takes up space and it forces your brain down and compromises the medulla because there's nowhere for the brain to go but down because it's in a closed compartment. So we say that people who have tumors up here herniate their brain, which means they move it down, move it out, move it. And there's nowhere for the brain to go but down. And it compromises the medulla, thereby killing the individual. So, we look at the brain like this. This is from the other hemisphere. This area down here, which consists of your mesencephalon, metencephalon, and myelencephalon, are your brain stem. Here's your part of your diencephalon up here, but this is your brain stem. What you notice, everybody has to see this. I have to hold this model. If I drop this, this will be very bad. Okay, this is a very heavy model. So this has two sides. Here's your brain stem. And what I want you to see is how the hemispheres are developed over these old areas of the brain. See these two big hemispheres we have? The big old bulgy things out there. And what we have here are the things that control vital functions and lower down functions. And here they are. And those two hemispheres develop over it. So the reason I bring this up as a fundamental principle is because I was trained in evolutionary biology. And so what you have is that if you look through the animal kingdom, what you see is that the brainstem doesn't really change that much in what it looks like. You look through the brainstem of your dog, it looks pretty much just like your brainstem, okay? And it does the same things that your brainstem does. But look at what we have. Here's a fish, he doesn't have any brain up there. And, the amphibian, we're going to come back to that. And as you go down here, what you notice, we get these two big developed hemispheres out here. Okay? We should be okay on time, right?
We're fine on time, but I hate to say, we do have a problem. I know many of you had difficulty parking. Unfortunately, 7 vehicles are in places that violate the fire code, and we're going to have to ask you to move them. I'm terribly sorry to interrupt about this, but here it is. I will give a description of the car and the license plate number, and I hope one or the other works with the memory cells that, oh well, never mind. A Nissan Altima Gray G4446F. Suzuki Vitara Navy Blue 438 BRS. Mini Cooper Red 708, I think that is, QLL. A Toyota Avalon Black B1400B. A Buick LeSabre, this says RL071, which doesn't seem likely, but perhaps you'll recognize. A Toyota Camry White 447 BYD, and finally a Honda Civic Navy Blue Z540625. That's a drive-out tag from an automobile dealership. I apologize very much for interrupting.
We don't want anybody's car towed. That would be really, really bad. Because, you know, that's like being at the grocery store, and you park your car and you're in a hurry, you go in the grocery store, you come out, you say, I have no clue where I parked. And you're looking around, everybody's car is white, black, or silver. Okay? And I know why people get those cars with that weird blue and everything. Okay? And it's so they can identify their car when they come out of the grocery store. So we don't want you all roaming out there and wondering, was my car got towed, or I just don't remember where I left it? Okay, so we were talking about how things change as we go along the evolutionary pathway here, which is not linear, by the way, but nonetheless, what you see is it's the hemispheres that become so well developed. And if you think of the hemispheres in the outer part of it, the cortex, as the wrinkly part you associate with looking at, you know, Halloween models of the brain and everything. The reason they're wrinkled is because in humans, if you were to flatten the cortex out, it's about 2.5 square feet. So in order for it to fit in your skull, it has to be scrunched up. And so it's all wrinkled like that so it can get scrunched up and put in the cranium, okay? So if we... Now let's look at another little guy. That's a guy I used to date. Okay? Okay, right there. Okay. Well, why are the ladies laughing and not the men? Whatever. Okay. Actually, that's an animal that I used to do research on, and he has a very handsome little brain. This is a Bufo-Marinus toad from South America, and in evolution, you need to have a big brain or a trick. So we have a big brain, and he has a trick. When he gets scared, he huffs and puffs and blows himself up enormously, which means if you tried to eat him, you'd get him caught in your throat, and then you'd cough him out because you wouldn't be able to breathe. You know, this toad huff and puff. And the other, he has a second trick, which is why he's been so successful, is on the side of his little head there, he's got poison glands. And so it tastes really nasty. So, you know, you go to start to eat him and he huffs and puffs and then he tastes bad anyway. So you really spit him out. So a big brain or a trick. Okay, so he has a trick. He has a little brain. But this area here, which I labeled superior colliculus, which looks huge in his brain, is also found in our brain, except it's teensy. Okay? I mean, it's just a teensy little structure. And I could point it out to you on this brain model, but it's too small for anybody here to see. But both of them do the same thing. So in the toad, here's what it does. The toad's sitting there like this, and he doesn't have much of a neck, you notice. Okay? He sits there like this, and some small, dark, jerky thing comes into his field of view. Like this. The toad turns his entire body like this, shoots his tongue out at the small, jerky, dark thing that came into his visual field. Okay? So the superior colliculus orients you to novel things in your visual world. Now, for the toad, that means you stick your tongue out and you eat it. The superior colliculus does exactly the same thing in us with a little modification. Okay, and that is when something comes into our visual field that's novel, we turn and look at it. We usually don't stick out our tongues, okay? We usually don't do that, but we turn and look at it. So this gives you the clue what the difference is. That tiny structure, big structure in his brain, is involved in orienting to novel things that come into the field of vision. The difference between them and us is he's hardwired. Any small, dark, jerky thing that comes into his field of view, he will stick out his tongue and try to eat it. It doesn't matter if it's a piece of cardboard that you dangle in front of him. It doesn't make any difference. He orients, he sticks out his tongue. What we do is we turn and we interpret what it is, and we make a decision. And that requires the higher levels of the brain. I turn and say, oh, it's just a fly, or oh, it's a person that moved into my field of vision. Who is that person? So we interpret what we see of that novelty that's brought in. But what that structure is doing is the same in both cases. It's orienting to something novel coming within the field of vision. So the brainstem is very similar in all these animals, and what is different is here. Now we have another guy I dated here somewhere. There he is. Okay? That's one of our closest, cousins, living relatives, chimpanzee. Very, very smart. Does a whole lot of interpretation of the world. And I want you to notice the difference between our brain and his brain. Okay? Really, really, really smart animal. Can use tools, can form together in a group and go and raid another group. That's like warfare. Okay? Take care of their young in complex ways. Can do all kinds of very complex things, but I want you to look at the difference here. Okay? And it's the difference that we're going to be interested in. Now, do you think an animal like a toad has much memory of things that happen? Let me give you an example. You take a piece of cardboard and you put a little dark thing on it, and you dangle it in front of him. Every single time, he'll stick his tongue out at it. Do you think he has very good memory? Not too good, okay. Can never remember to bring flowers to me. Anyway, and this guy, now he's got a pretty good memory. Do you think a chimpanzee can remember where a rival chimp troop is at? You betcha, okay. Now, your dog has a good memory, right? Okay, so let's think about the dog. What sensory system do you think was one of the very first that led to a strong memory? What does your dog remember? What does your dog do the first thing he goes outside? Sticks his nose to the ground, right? It's the olfactory system that first shows up in animals being associated with memory. They smell the scent of another animal and they know whether it's a friendly animal, an unfriendly animal. Whether it's something to be feared or something to go towards. Maybe it's a female in estrus or something, so maybe it's something that's good. Maybe it's not good. Maybe it's another male, maybe we got to stay out of his territory. So memory developed to allow an organism to remember something that happened before and to apply that to current behavior. Does that make sense to everyone? So you have to think, we're going to be talking about memory, like you remember an event that took place 20 years ago, or you remember a person you met. We're going to be talking about this high order stuff. But you need to think about, why did memory evolve in the first place? And think of what it allows an animal to do, to remember what happened yesterday or last week, and to guide future action, okay, of which we are the prime example. Okay. So what we're going to focus a lot on is the cortex, and this is where it starts getting really interesting. The cortex, the word cortex means bark, like the bark of a tree. So I realize that you people in the back can't hardly see me because I'm short. But the word cortex means the bark of a tree. So it's the outer covering of our telencephalon, or our hemispheres. So it's the little wrinkled part that you look at if you were to look down at a real brain. Okay? And the cortex is where all the higher order things are going on. And it's made up of layers of neurons. So we'll learn more about this next time. But it's just 1 to 4 millimeters thick bark. Think of the bark of a tree. It only extends for a tiny distance. It's very thin. So the cortex is just the outer layer of nerve cells. But this is where all subjective experience, all learning, memory, ability to follow a movie, line, story, our ability to recognize someone we know, our ability to feel love, our ability to love, all of these things are controlled by the cortex, okay, in us, all controlled by the cortex. So how do we talk about the cortex? Well, let's move Fred over here like this. This is rostral, so this is the front of the brain. This is caudal, this is back of the brain. The cortex is the outer covering of the telencephalon, which is the highest order area of the brain. The lobes of the brain, which are, so if you thought about the body, you've got a head, you've got a thorax, you've got a pelvis, you've got extremities. In the brain, in the cortex, what we do is we call different areas by different names, and they're named because of the bones that overlie them. So overlying this area of the cortex is a skull, and that skull is made up of bones that have names. So this is the frontal lobe, the parietal lobe, the occipital lobe, and the temporal lobe. So these are lobes of the brain that basically just are names that we give. So this area that controls moral behavior, executive function, is in the frontal lobe. Okay? I'll be talking about some other lobes here in just a minute. And lastly, we have another weird one called the limbic lobe. And the limbic lobe is a group of structures on the medial aspect of the hemisphere that control learning, memory, and emotion. So what do we really remember? Emotionally charged things. Does it make sense to everyone why that would be important? You have an organism that can use something that happened in the past to guide future action. Well, you need to have it be somewhat important, right? You don't remember everything, do you? But you know, let's say you had a really negative experience in something. Boy, you remember that one, don't you? Okay? You may not remember it totally accurately. What you recall is the feeling you had in that negative experience. So learning, memory, and emotion are associated with each other, and they're controlled, we're going to learn, by structures that are on this medial aspect of the hemisphere. Now, they're associated with other things, okay, but they're controlled by those structures. So, here we go. We're going to review this. And by the way, I never talk about anything that I don't come back to. So, on our second lecture that we're going to have next week, I'm going to review what we've talked about today and then move on. Okay, so every time I'm going to do that. So don't worry if you don't get it all today. Okay, so here's the rostral part of our brain. Here's the caudal, dorsal, and ventral. This is our frontal lobe, our parietal lobe, occipital lobe, and temporal lobe. And again, if a physician says, I have a patient with a lesion in the temporal lobe, the physician knows exactly what functions are controlled by the temporal lobe, so they don't have to say to their colleague, well, what did your patient lose, or what problem does your patient have? Because they already know. Because they know what the temporal lobe does. And so I want you to be able to leave this class not just knowing a little bit about learning and memory and how it might be very different than what you think it is, but I want you to have a general idea about how the brain is organized and how it works, so that when you hear anything in the news about the brain, it makes more sense to you, okay? Even if it's not about learning and memory. Yes?
Will you in later lectures say anything about concussions and fractured skulls?
I can, okay? I will be making sure that there's plenty of time, that we have a general session where you can ask me anything you want, okay? So, let's, limbic lobe, again, learning and memory. This is just that it's on the medial aspect of the hemisphere here. Cortex, but the medial aspect of it. And now, so some of the little cortical areas have numbers associated with them. And I'm just briefly going to say this. Some guy back in 1900 used new methods that looked at nerve cells, and he chopped up the cortex. And here's what he noticed. He'd go back here, he'd go chop, 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 and he'd look with a microscope, and it all looked the same. And then all of a sudden, the layers would look different. So it'd be like in this room that we divided it into 6 layers, let's say, and all of you were sitting here and you have different clothes on, and you're males and females and everything. And then if I said, everybody scramble and move some other way. Okay? So if you went chop, 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 and everybody was sitting where they are, he gave it a number. When he saw it change, he gave it a different number. And what he found was that when he looked at the whole cortex, there were about 50 different areas that were different in how the neurons were arranged. Now, this was 1900, and his name was Corbinian Brogman, German. He had no idea this was true, but guess what, guys? Now we're in 2014. Brogman's terminology is still used in the medical profession because those ways neurons were arranged underlie differences in function. And so Brogman's terminology has been retained. And because I don't want to use a lot of jargon, it's just that if there's a number on something, it just means the number Corbinian Brogman gave that area of the cortex. Okay, that's all that means. And again, he just chopped up the cortex and looked, he called this 17, that 18, that 19, that's all in the occipital lobe, right? Okay, so physicians know the numbering system, they know what lobe all the numbers are in. So if I said to anyone in this room as a physician, I have a patient who has a large tumor in area 17, that physician would know, number one, exactly where the tumor was at, number two, that the person would be functionally blind. Because area 17 controls the person's ability to have a subjective experience of vision. Okay? So this is how this is done, and this is how physicians talk to each other. Okay, now, don't worry about the words. I really put the words on there so that if you go to the website and pull up these slides, there's enough words there for you to understand what the concept is, okay? So what we're going to do is I'm going to take you through a couple of lobes, and I'm going to tell you some functions. You're going to see a general principle emerge. And it's that principle I want to leave you with, and the principle I want you to think about this week before we talk together the next time. Okay? And I hope that this, if you've never had a course on the brain, you should be amazed. You should be amazed at what the cortex does. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to start, here's our brain, here's our cortex, and I'm going to start with the frontal lobe here. I'm going to start with the frontal lobe, so I'm going to start rostrally, and I'm going to talk about a couple of functions. Now, note, I'm only going to mention a couple of functions. There are hundreds of other functions. Okay, but you already get that point, right? So we can't talk about all a couple hundred, okay? I'm going to start here with the frontal lobe. This area up here is the area I've been talking about that's involved in executive function, like weighing the consequences of your actions, applying moral standards to behavior, okay? But now farther back, this area right here is involved in the ability to make a voluntary movement of some part of the body. So that movement is planned up here and then executed by this area here. So let's have a look at this. Okay, so the area that controls voluntary movement is called primary motor cortex, and it's a strip of tissue that lies right here, and it lies right here in the cortex, right there in the middle. And it's organized such, and a student did this. That's not a very flattering picture of me. Okay? That's supposed to be a redhead, okay? With a hair kind of orange. Anyway, I don't think it's very flattering. But this is this area of the cortex cut and then turned so you can look at it. Okay? So it turns out that the face is represented here and the leg is represented here. And that's why when I want to walk towards the projector, I walk with my legs. Okay? I don't go like that and try to reach out. If I want to touch the brain model, the hand area is controlling the voluntary movement. So my prefrontal area, which is located up here, plans the movement. She wants to walk towards the projector. Notice what you have to do. First of all, you have to have tone in your anti-gravity muscles to hold you up against gravity. You have to turn your entire body, but keep yourself from losing your balance. And you have to be able to extend one leg and then the next leg. And notice how the whole pelvis shifts as you do that, as you make a voluntary movement in space. And your arms swing by your side. You're not aware of that. That's a habit that the brain controls, but it happens. Okay? So what part of the body moves depends on what area gets stimulated. So if I want to smile or want to talk, I have to move my face muscles. I have to make that happen. That's a voluntary movement. Okay? So if you smile, that's voluntary. Now, there are smiles that aren't voluntary, but most of the time, if you smile voluntarily, that's controlled by your cortex. And it's specifically controlled by the area of the motor cortex that controls your face musculature. Now, making a voluntary movement, we're going to come back to this next time. Your leg is up here. There's your leg represented over there. Notice how it has that's your whole leg, guys. But look at your mouth. Your mouth has a huge representation. The reason for that is because language means that you have to be able to control the muscles in your face and around your mouth very specifically to make all those sounds that are found in your language and put them together. When you move, it's a gross movement, right? It's a gross movement of the body. So you don't have to have as many neurons up here controlling walking in space as you do being able to talk with articulation. Okay? Does that make sense to everyone? So the finer the movement you need, the more neurons you need. So looky, looky, looky. Look at our hand. Our hand is a huge representation. Okay? And that's because of all the fine motor skills we have. So we don't have such fine motor skills with our toes. Chimpanzees do. They have like we have a thumb out here, that's how their big toe is. So they can grab a hold of branches and do manipulate things in the world with their big toe. Okay? Yes?
But what about dancers? They must be
That's excellent. Well, let's go ahead and tell you something amazing. Okay? So here we have, how many people in here play a musical instrument? Okay? Some of you play violin, some of you play piano, some of you play whatever. And as you practice and you get better and better at the fine motor skills, the representation for that part of your body gets bigger. That's called plasticity. Brain plasticity. Okay? So when you first learn how to play the piano, you know, bang, 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 and then you get better and you get better, hopefully. You get better and better. Dancing is the same thing. I love it when people learn how to dance, they look at their feet. Your feet really can't move without you looking at them, right? And you go, let's see, 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. 1, 1, 2, no, 2, 3. Okay? Once you learn how to dance, notice how you move. You move smoothly. And that's because your brain has gotten the pattern of what you're doing. You no longer have to think about it. Unless some man is trying to lead you in the foxtrot when it's a waltz. Okay? And 1, 2, 3, 4 isn't the same thing as 1, 2, 3. If you gentlemen didn't know that. Okay. So we have brain plasticity, so you have the areas. Teachers have bigger representations for speech because that's normally how we teach. Okay? And so there is a emphasis on articulation. So anybody who does any kind of speaking and everything. Okay? So that's a little bit of function in the frontal lobe. Maybe that's not the most interesting in the world, but now we're going to get really interesting. That still isn't a flattering picture of me. Okay. And again, a medical student did that. They think they're funny. Okay. But I always get the last laugh because I had good grades. Okay. Okay. So now right behind primary motor cortex, now we're in the parietal lobe. So we're in a different lobe. Behind that is called primary sensory cortex. Now, motor cortex is an outgo. Does that make sense? I decide to make a voluntary movement, but things have to go out to the muscle to make me be able to move, right? In order for me to feel something from my leg, the information has to go that direction. Because what's responsible for subjective experience? The cortex. So if I'm touching my leg, I don't have any subjective experience till that information gets to my cortex. Does that make sense to everyone? So that's a going up system, whereas motor is going out. In order for me to move my hand like this, I decide to do it with my cortex, but I have to go out into the peripheral nervous system to make the muscles move. Okay? So to feel something, I have to have the information come in. So this is primary somatosensory cortex, and it's organized in a way similar to motor cortex. So there's my leg again up there, just like it was motor cortex, out on the crest, over on the edge of the crest, and then my face represented down here. You notice there's a little difference, but you notice something. Notice how your lips have a huge representation, have a representation almost as great as your entire leg. Okay? You're not very sensitive on your legs. Your lips are really sensitive. Just tear a piece of skin on your lips sometime. Okay? Very sensitive. Okay? So our lips and our hands, the tips of our fingers, okay? If you are blind, you basically use the tips of your fingers to feel the different textures and everything. But even for us, if I run my finger along my face and along this table at the same time, the tablecloth here feels completely different. It feels different not just because it is different, but because my brain interprets what comes in from my body as being completely different. Okay? Now, so this is how we sense and feel things in our body. Now let's get really interesting here. Okay? So let's look back here. This is still parietal lobe. This is still about feeling your body. So let me tell you about a patient. Okay? So now this person, our theoretical patient, this is intact, there's no damage to it or whatever, but behind here there's some damage. And this is where you have some higher order somatosensory areas. So just being able to feel something is higher order in that it requires the cortex. But in order to interpret what you feel, that's higher order. Okay? Does that make sense? Okay. So it's higher order to determine what it is you feel exactly, or to be able to differentiate one sensation from another is higher order. Not just that you were touched, but what the quality of that touch is. Well, now let's go even higher. Okay? We use our own body as the reference for what is in the world. And that should make sense to everyone. We're like a closed system. I look out here and I see you all sitting in the audience, and I'm up here and this is my body. So when my leg is touched, I'm the one who feels it. You don't feel it. Although notice that human beings have empathy. It means when we see someone else like cut their finger and they bleed, we look at it and we have like an emotional reaction as though something happened to us. We have neurons in our brain that fire when they see things happen to somebody else. Okay? And this is normally a good thing. So we have neurons that fire when we see somebody move their mouth and speak. And if we watch their mouth, the neurons in our brain are firing too, even though we're not speaking. They're called mirror neurons. And when we see someone hurt, someone's body touched, neurons of our own body signal like where that person is touched. Okay, this is very interesting. Now, back here are going to be even higher order things related to touch. So I'm going to give you a theoretical patient. He has everything is intact everywhere in his brain except for one little tiny area right here. And that little tiny area is not in this hemisphere, it's in the other one. Okay? So it'd be like on Fred is a right hemisphere, This is the front, this is the back, and there'd be another hemisphere over here. So it'd be like on Fred, it would be somebody who has damage to this tiny area right here. This person, if you were a physician and you're in the room with this person alone, you could hold up this person's arm and you could say, "Do you see this?" And the person would say, "Yes." And the physician would say, "Do you feel what's happening here?" "Yes." Whose hand is that? Whose arm is that? And the patient would look at it, and they would say, "Well, doc, you and I are the only ones in this room. It must be yours." The person does not recognize the left side of their body as belonging to them. This is what I mean by higher order. Okay? We take it for granted that I know that my body belongs to me, to a thing called me, which is a construct of my brain. It is not a reality. It's what my brain constructs. It's a construction. That doesn't mean there isn't a real world out there, but all we know of that world is what our brain tells us is out there. And the fact that I see this as being separate from this table is not an accident, guys. It's something that develops as you develop and your brain develops. So these individuals no longer see the left side of their body as belonging to them. And that means a person can be paralyzed on the left side of their body, and they'll deny they're paralyzed. They'll say there's nothing wrong with their body. And they'll attempt to get out of a wheelchair and move, and they'll fall to the floor, and they're completely confused about why that is happening. This is called contralateral neglect. So the lesion is on the right in this tiny area of the brain, and it causes the person to deny that the left half of their body belongs to them. They think they can see it, they can feel it, but it belongs to somebody else, not to them. It means they don't comb this side of their hair, they don't dress this side of their body, they do not brush this side of their teeth. They do not eat food on that side of the mouth. Your ability, this is my body and that is someone else's body, is a construction of your brain. And what did I tell you? There's nothing you can do, there's nothing you can sense, there is nothing that can happen that can't be taken away from you. Even your ability to realize that this is my body can be taken away. Okay? These patients suffer terribly for obvious reasons. We have about at least 5 minutes, Norma? Okay, so we're fine. Okay. So, that's pretty amazing, don't you think? Yes?
Does the brain necessarily protect the meat items or involuntary items, protect it more? Or is it all?
No, it's just all protected. Because it's all really interrelated. So lesions take away one part of a network of things and lead to what they lead to. We'll come to some of that with patients, okay? We'll see that. Okay, the visual system, okay? Now we need to go back here to the occipital lobe, and that's back here, okay? So the occipital lobe, y'all, that's an eyeball, and so, you know, you've got to get things up to the cortex to see. You don't see with your eyeballs. You see with your cortex, okay? Your eye's only function is to focus light on a particular area of the eyeball in order to send an electrical signal to the brain to be interpreted. You don't see, just see, you see people. You see people you put in classes, female, male, pink jacket, red jacket. You interpret what you see. You don't just see, you interpret. That's the whole purpose of the cortex, is to interpret the world. So let me tell you about some patients here. And here now we're going to go to higher to upper sort of functions here. When you look at the visual system, in primates, vision dominates. Vision is wonderful for us because it allows us to make an interpretation at a distance. So let's imagine you're a dog. You know, you smell something and it's right here, but you can't smell something a long way away, right? Okay, unless it's in the air and then you can't localize it well or whatever. Vision is great because you can recognize and interpret the world at a distance. Gives you great advantage, okay? Particularly in being a predator, gives you great advantage. So we have two systems in our brain. We have, this is where the signal is first sent for you to have subjective experience of seeing. And then from there, information goes up here into the parietal lobe that tells you where something is at, and this tells you what it is. Okay? So this is easy to remember. Where? Everything is always in terms of our body. Things are always someplace in relation to us. And remember, that's what the parietal lobe does. The parietal lobe's about feeling, and it's about our bodies. Right? That's what we just covered. So your visual system now is going to be coordinated with this, that looks around, and now that we've come in through those doors, we remember where those doors are in relation to where our body is right now. This is an incredible ability to do that. You don't just head off to some random place if you want to leave if you came in through those doors. You're sitting here. You never sat there before in your life. You get up and you head towards those doors. Okay? And so it's because your brain does this. Okay? So, what something is, we're going to come back to that. Let's go back to 17. I'm going to tell you some really interesting experiments. If you have a patient who damaged the back of their head and damaged this area 17 in the occipital lobe. So let's imagine the person's walking down and they trip on the sidewalk, they fall backwards, and they damage this area of the brain. This person would tell you that they were blind. Okay? This is kind of interesting. So this person would tell you that they were blind, and they are blind according to the law. They would tell you they were blind. But you might notice something interesting. If this person were walking and they came near this table, they would move out of the way. Okay? And some scientists noticed this and thought, well, that's a little odd. So they say to the person, how did you know that was there? And they were trying to think about air currents were different, you know, and their body could feel it or whatever. But they avoid running into things, and they tell you they have no idea how they do it. So they did an experiment, and they said to people who had this kind of brain damage, and said, every single time we flash a light, hit the buzzer. And the person said, well, I can't do that because I'm blind. You don't need to do this because I can't see anything. Okay? So they did it, and lo and behold, the person was as good as a normal person. And the patient said, that can't be, I'm blind. Ah, you know what it is? They can see, but they're unaware that they can see. Awareness is a cortical function. Just like the somatosensory person is unaware that this half of their body belongs to them, in the visual system, the person can see, but they're unaware that they can see. Awareness means you have subjective experience. What is the purpose of the cortex? Subjective experience and voluntary action. So the person actually can see, they're unaware that they can see. Now, let's move down here, and let's imagine somebody's totally intact there, and now he has a lesion in a little tiny area here. Okay, so now he's got some kind of damage there. Well, lo and behold, this person can see perfectly fine because 17's intact. He's aware that he can see because it's intact. And the person's sister is sitting in the audience. And he can describe what she looks like, can talk about her color of her hair, her eyes, how she wears her hair, how tall she is, everything else. But if he's in the audience, he can look at every individual person's face and not be able to find his sister. Because he can't put the identity with what the face looks like. And some of you saw that, the man who mistook his wife for a hat. That's what that was about. He had a lesion in the area of his brain. He could describe every detail of what his wife looked like. He couldn't pick her out in a room of people. There are other areas in this what part of the visual system where a person loses the ability to tell a cow and a horse apart. They can describe the difference, but when they look at a group of horses and cows together, they can't tell them apart. Can't tell a cauliflower from a broccoli. Let me repeat, if I didn't say this enough, there's nothing you can do. There's nothing you experience, no ability you have, nothing you can do that can't be taken away with the right brain lesion. Every single experience you have, thought you have, movement you make, every single thing is controlled by the brain. So people lose these things and can't put them together any longer, and if those neurons have been damaged permanently, they're gone forever. Okay? They're gone forever. So, let's end with a description, a little bit of language. Language is probably one of the highest order functions that we have. If you're an English-speaking person, you understand me because your brain interprets the sounds, puts them together in something that's meaningful. And you can't ever listen to an English-speaking person and not understand what they're saying. I mean, unless they use words you've never heard before or something. But normally you can follow what they say and you don't have any trouble whatsoever. If I started all of a sudden talking in some language that no one in this room understood, it'd just be like a bunch of meaningless sounds. So as you develop, as Pierce and Liam are developing, they are hearing the sounds, the subset of sounds spoken in the English language. Their little brains are taking that subset of sounds and their brain is trying to make sense of it. And then they're going to start babbling and trying to make those sounds. The mirror neurons, they're going to start trying to make the sounds. A baby is born being able to speak any language spoken on the planet Earth. And by the way, there's like 6,000 languages spoken on the planet Earth. That's it. 1,000 of them are spoken in New Guinea. 1,000 separate languages of the 6,000 languages on the planet are spoken in New Guinea. That means a person who lives in this area of New Guinea travels 20 miles away and somebody speaks an entirely different language, you can't understand a thing that the person's saying. But every baby on the face of this planet can speak any language spoken on the face of the planet, but you're only exposed to individual languages. If your parents are bilingual, you might be exposed to 2 or 3, but the point is that most children are exposed to 1. So it's those sounds that the brain takes out, it's those sounds that the baby tries to mimic, and pretty soon the baby goes, mama, and everybody's like, woo, and it's like, the neurons are working, yes, okay, and then they get 2 and you can't shut them up, okay? So there are particular areas of the brain. This area right here allows you to speak language, which means if you're an adult, you have a stroke in Broca's area, you now can understand your native language fine, but you can no longer speak it. So you go to say something, you say to someone with a mild Broca's, you say something to them, and instead of saying, I'm going to take the dog for a walk in the park later this afternoon, instead of saying that, they'll try to get it out, and they'll go, dog, walk. Or if they have a severe Broca's, they can't speak language anymore at all, okay? But they can still understand it, because this is the area that allows you to understand language. So a person who has what's called a Wernicke's aphasia, which means an aphasia or lack of ability to speak language, that's called Wernicke's instead of Broca's. These are named after the famous guys who described them. If you have a Wernicke's aphasia, you can talk perfectly fine, but it's not going to make any sense because you can't understand language anymore. So when you say to that person, do you know why you're in the hospital today? You know, that some of you have been hospitalized. Doctors ask you this because they want to see if you're oriented to place and time. Do you know why you're in this audience today? Never mind. Okay. So a person with Wernicke's aphasia starts, the sky is blue and the dog was black, and, I went for a walk and the floor had black on it, and then yuck, 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 and it doesn't make any sense. But it's grammatical. but it's meaningless. You say, do you know why you were in the hospital today? And the person just starts talking. And of course that signals to the physician where in the brain the problem is. And these areas back here allow you to read and write. So it goes without saying, if you have a large stroke, the same artery supplies this area in the brain. If you have a large stroke that involves these areas, you can wake up one day, you don't understand what anyone's saying to you. It's like they're speaking a foreign language, we think. You can't speak to them, and you can no longer read or write. And a very, very human function is gone. Okay? Thank you all. Next time we will do some more brain.